At the beginning of the Common Era, India was the world's biggest economy. It's estimated that they were producing about a third of the world's goods and services, and between them and China, almost 60% of all output. India was the economic superpower of the world for centuries, remaining in the number 1 or 2 position for about 1700 years. Between most of the 16th and 19th centuries, the region was ruled by the Mughal Empire. Their interregional trade was massive, supplying Europe and Asia with silk, yarn, oils, sugars, and many other supplies. Europe was heavily dependent on India's exports, while India was mostly self-sufficient. They were rich with natural resources and a thriving labour force. But sometime in the 1700s, India began declining as a share of economic output. So what happened? Well, they were doing so well economically, especially relative to other nations, that they had very little competition in many markets. They had no need to improve their agricultural process, to reduce labour costs, or to invent new technologies. So they didn't. But that wasn't true for the Western European economies. They had intense competition between the regions and they were losing. The market dynamics led to the British Agricultural Revolution, making huge leaps in crop rotation and infrastructure to reduce labour costs. Agriculture was still the source of India's biggest economic output, but it was stagnating and their competitive position in the world began to slip. And as the British Empire became stronger and stronger, they began expanding it around the world, pushing into new territories and eventually into India. From 1858, India came under British rule, and they continued to develop its economy. While they did do this primarily for their own self-interests, they did ultimately bring new technologies to the region. They built roads and canals, but India's share of the world economy continued to shrink. And when British rule ended in 1947, they represented just 4.2% of global output. With the scars of British imperialism still raw, they decided to take their economic policy in a completely different direction. They created 5-year government plans that bared resemblance to the Soviet Union. They weren't exactly communist, but they nationalized most industries and adopted protectionist policies. They favored local productions over imports, an attempt to revive their previously successful self-sufficiency. But outside of government-operated industries, there was free trade. People could run businesses if they got their hands on difficult-to-obtain permits and licenses. India's economy did grow during this period, but at a much slower rate than other nations. And their share of global GDP continued to fall, reaching 3.1% in 1973, despite having almost 15% of the world's population. They were a shadow of the powerhouse they once were. But their fortune was about to change again.
I think India is definitely a much better place than before.
India will be the 3rd largest economy soon.
Driven by tax breaks and proximity to the booming Indian market, global funds are flocking to Gift City, India's new financial hub.
Around 1999, something happened that kicked India into another gear. It supercharged their development and today produces over $3.5 trillion of economic output. The story of India's modern transformation is absolutely fascinating. It involves wars, debt crises, the formation of no-tax cities, but also reveals some pretty ugly truths about whose pockets this new wealth is falling into. I'm going to pause the video just for a moment to talk about the sponsor of today's video, Private Internet Access. Imagine you're subscribed to Netflix, but when you log on, you're only given access to a fraction of the shows. Well, you don't have to imagine, because that's exactly what's happening if you don't use a VPN. A VPN is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel. And since many websites and streaming services have location-based content, Using a VPN allows you to access the full library. A private internet access VPN allows you to change your IP address to one of 91 countries and all 50 US states. But most importantly, you shouldn't ever be browsing the internet with an unencrypted connection. Unprotected devices transfer an enormous amount of data that can be intercepted by hackers. Passwords, keystrokes, or even your photos can be stolen, and it's especially vulnerable when you're using free public Wi-Fi like at a cafe or the airport. With just one account, you can protect unlimited devices, computers, phones, tablets, and even your TV, no matter which operating systems you have, whether it's Android, Windows, Mac, iOS, Linux, or even others. Private internet access is giving my audience a huge 83% discount so that you can subscribe for just $2.03 per month, and you get 4 extra months for free. Go to piavpn.com/Hamish. The link is also down in the description below. So what exactly happened in the 90s that transformed India's economy? Well, as the saying goes, no pain, no gain. India would be brought to the brink of bankruptcy before things would start to turn around. India had a balance of payments crisis in 1991. The balance of payments is a record of the money flowing in and out of a country, flowing in from producing goods domestically and exporting them to other countries, and money flowing out from importing goods produced by other countries. It also includes capital flows by consumers and financial transactions, so it's a different figure than the trade balance, which is just imports and exports. If the balance is in surplus, it means that money is flowing into the country. And on the other hand, if it's in deficit, it means that money is flowing out of the country. That deficit is paid for with the country's foreign exchange reserves. The central bank depletes some of its US dollars or euros. India's balance of payments deficit began expanding in the late 70s. India was a victim of something known as the Volcker shock. Paul Volcker, the chair of the US Federal Reserve at the time, was rapidly raising US interest rates to combat their inflation crisis. While this was effective at reducing US inflation, it strengthened the US dollar against other currencies. So importing goods, which is mostly done in US dollars, became much more expensive. And India was already in a trade deficit, so this exacerbated their outflows, further depleting the country's foreign exchange reserves. But that was just the first blow. In 1990, Iraq invaded one of the OPEC countries called Kuwait, causing oil to spike from $17 in July 1990 to $39 by September. India was a big importer of oil, so this worsened their balance of payments situation. The last big nail in the coffin for this crisis was the fall of the Eastern Bloc in 1991. The US-Soviet Union Cold War ended and the Communist coalition was dissolved. India had strong trade relations with the Soviet Union, and as geopolitical conflicts reached a tipping point, so did India's balance of payments crisis. In June of 1991, India had just 3 weeks of essential imports in their foreign exchange reserves. India was on the brink of bankruptcy. They needed a lifeboat, and that lifeboat was the IMF. The International Monetary Fund gave India a $2.2 billion emergency loan. But it wasn't the loan that ultimately saved India, it was the loan's conditions. This was what's called a structural adjustment loan, which basically means in order for India to get the money, they needed to make changes to their economic system, adopting characteristics that were known to increase economic growth, reduce the balance of payments deficit, and bring more people above the poverty line. It kickstarted what is now known as the economic liberalization of India. India's first Prime Minister since the crisis was Narasimha Rao, and one of the most important things he did was get rid of Licence Raj. Licence Raj was a set of regulations that had been in place since the 50s that made it really difficult for businesses to obtain the licenses they needed to operate. Removing these licenses profoundly improved India's economic activity, and since then, India has been an economic machine, with GDP increasing from $266 billion in 1991 to over $3.5 trillion today. But let's step back for a second. It's easy to be awed by India's astounding economic development, but it doesn't tell the whole story, the experiences of the 1.4 billion people who live there. And one of the things that GDP doesn't tell us is how that new wealth is being shared. Who's benefiting? GDP per capita, which measures economic output per person, has been increasing, but it lags behind other growing nations. In 2023, GDP per capita was estimated to be $2,600. By comparison, in China and Russia, it's about $13,000. And in the US, it's about $80,000. Of course, no one's expecting India to have GDP per capita anywhere near the US, for example, who have had a much longer period of economic expansion, but it does show that they do have a very long way to go. And as low as that per capita figure is, it too doesn't tell the whole story. Most of the economic growth has been concentrated in a handful of states and cities. The poorest state, Bihar, had per capita GDP of just $625. And the poorest states aren't small. Bihar is home to 131 million people. Almost 440 million people live in the 5 poorest states, more than 30% of India's population. Check out this income distribution graph. It's probably the best demonstration of who's benefiting. All income ranges saw large increases between 2000 and 2020. The lower percentiles, the poorest people, saw wages rise about 80 to 100% in total over 20 years. The middle class saw the lowest growth, while the top 1% took almost a third of all the income growth. According to Oxfam, between 2012 and 2021, about 40% of the wealth created went to 1% of the population. And just 3% of the wealth created went to the bottom 50%. While government policies certainly play a role in how wealth is distributed, the income disparities are largely a symptom of capitalism. When you allow people to freely trade and transact with one another, a small number of people are going to benefit far more than others. Increasing wealth inequality isn't just a problem in India, it's a problem in most capitalist countries, including the US. India has also suffered from persistently high inflation. Prices rose 5.5% in 2023, and so interest rates have needed to be kept high. And then there's education, one of the critical foundations of a thriving economy. In 1951, just 18.3% of the population was literate. In 2018, it reached 74.4%, which is an impressive improvement, but it's still below even the world's average of 86.3%. There is clearly room for improvement, especially to make sure that the growing economic benefits are shared among the entire population. And in spite of wealth inequality, the rising tide of economic reforms is raising all boats. Between 2011 and 2019, the World Bank reported that India halved the number of people living in extreme poverty. And coincidentally, 2011 was the year India launched Gift City to the world. India has been building a finance hub in Gujarat that aims to become the next Dubai or Singapore. One of the biggest problems that many countries face is big corporations offshoring their profits to save money on taxes. Meta Platforms, for example, does this in Australia. In 2022, they made $1.1 billion of revenue, but charged the Australian Meta subsidiary $949 million for advertising revenue, essentially moving all of their profits out of Australia and into their Singapore holding company, where they pay a low corporate tax rate of just 17%. This happens in India as well, so Gift City is the solution. Companies who set up their finance entity will pay no taxes for 10 out of the next 15 years. No GST and also no stamp duty. They streamlined regulatory approvals, making it easier for businesses to get set up, and created the GIFT International Stock Exchange so Indians can trade foreign shares through an exchange within the country. Even though they don't collect taxes, it's money that they wouldn't have received anyway, because the alternative is profits being offshored to Singapore or Dubai. And this way, they can still generate revenue on banking transaction fees, and it creates more domestic jobs. India hasn't stopped its economic reforms, and a lot of it can be credited to their current leader. Since 2014, Narendra Modi has been the Prime Minister of India. In the same year, he launched the Made in India initiative, a plan to encourage foreign companies to develop and manufacture products in India. to transform India into a global manufacturing hub, with the sector contributing 25% to GDP by 2022. And they've made considerable progress. In 2022, manufacturing reached 17.7% of GDP. Not quite the 25% they were aiming for, but progress nonetheless. Modi also launched Startup India, an initiative to encourage the creation of new businesses. The plan has 3 pillars: simplify the process for businesses by reducing unnecessary red tape, such as their new self-certification process that doesn't require inspections for the first 3 years; increased funding support and incentives, which they've put into practice by providing some income, capital gains, and investment tax exemptions; and finally, increased partnerships with universities to showcase innovation to students. Despite some of the underlying issues, India has a very bright future. S&P Global Ratings forecast that India's GDP will reach $7.3 trillion by 2030, surpassing Germany and Japan to become the 3rd largest economy in the world. Unlike China and the US, India has a very young population. The median age was just 28.7 in 2022, far below the US and China, who are at an age of 38. If India can continue to educate its people, improve the operating environment for businesses, and ensure that new wealth being created is being distributed fairly among all of the people who live in the country, then they'll earn their place among the economic superpowers of the 21st century, especially at a time where China's impressive growth story is facing huge problems, from their real estate collapse to their ballooning hidden debts propping up the economy. Check out my video on China's debt crisis here. I personally think it's the best video I've ever made, and subscribe if you enjoyed.